On April 1st, 2023, my friend and I went to the famed Trinity Site. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, the Trinity Site was a remote military research base in the middle of New Mexico located near Alamogordo. On July 16, 1945, the first ever atomic bomb was detonated here, leaving a crater half a mile wide and 8 feet deep, with a mushroom cloud that reached up to 40,000 feet into the air. This was all part of a governmental mission called the Manhattan Project, whose sole goal was to research nuclear fission and its potential for creating weapons in the hopes of ending the Second World War. Flash forward to today, and the Trinity Site and the surrounding area has been turned into a historic park. The park is only open for 2 days of the year, and visitors are able to walk through the blast radius, see remnants of the melted steel tower on which the bomb stood, and also find bits of green stone called trinitite that were glassed over during the initial explosion. The US government also erected a monument in the middle of the site, a large monolith made of black brick and rock with a metal plaque in the center that reads as follows. While I was taking photos, I noticed that on the back of the monolith there was a small paper crane wedged into the brick. At first glance this may mean nothing, however it is actually an homage to a young girl named Sadako. Sadako lived in Hiroshima and was in the city when the bomb was dropped. While she wasn't killed from the initial blast, she would later die in a long and grueling battle against cancer. While she was hospitalized, she would pass the time by folding paper cranes, creating up to nearly 1,000. The paper crane is now used in her memorials and has also become one of the key symbols of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial and several anti-nuclear organizations. Seeing that paper crane felt like a bucket of cold water. It was a reminder of what the Trinity Site is, of what was created there, and more importantly, what it led to. It suddenly was no longer a stale old historic site in the middle of nowhere for tourists to take tacky photos near, but rather, it felt like a monument to the end of the world. Now, let's go back in time for a moment to a man named Ishiro Honda. Honda was born on May 7th, 1911 and moved to Tokyo when he was little. There he saw films in a cinema for the first time in his life and was absolutely captivated by the medium. When he got older, he would later attend Nippon University, where he would study film alongside the likes of Akira Kurosawa. He even directed a few small-scale films of his own before being drafted into the military at the start of World War II. He would be in and out of service throughout the majority of the war, returning home to spend time with his wife and child, and he still tried to study and create films whenever he could. However, during his final deployment, he was taken as a prisoner of war in China. When the war finally ended, he came home to a country that was hardly recognizable. Where there was once cobbled streets, there were craters. Where there was once entire homes and villages, there was blackened rubble and ash. Years would pass, and he would later begin production on a science fiction epic. It was unlike anything people had seen at the time, as the genre wasn't nearly as popular in Japan as the Western world. But Ishiro Honda was determined to not make the typical sci-fi schlock that was so commonplace at the time. Rather, he wanted something that was experimental yet grounded, something that could capture the horrors of war that he and his nation had become all too familiar with. But in order to do so, he wasn't going to need just a movie. He was going to need a monster.
Over and over, I keep going over the world we knew. Once when you walked beside.
Wait, so what even is Godzilla?
That's a surprisingly complicated question. According to the first movie, he was an ancient creature awoken by nuclear tests in the Pacific. But throughout the years, he then evolved into a heroic figure, defending the Earth from aliens, underground people, and evil space gorillas.
Wait, What?
Yeah, try not to think about it too hard. In some movies, Godzilla is the living embodiment of all the vengeful spirits who were wrongfully killed by the Japanese during the Second World War, existing to punish Japan for their long-forgotten war crimes. But then in other movies, he's depicted as just a wild animal. He's been a legend, a myth, there's been 5 different Mechagodzillas, a Space Godzilla, he's fought the Power Rangers, the Gods of Olympus, mobsters, the Avengers, and even went to hell once. Okay, so maybe Godzilla isn't one concrete thing. Maybe he's a cultural icon whose filmography has put him above a singular identity. Similar to Batman or Superman, Godzilla is a character that thrives on reinvention, on being recreated and reshaped with each new generation. Godzilla fans often debate about what tone Godzilla should have. Should it remain a grounded science fiction monster story, or should it be a fun popcorn flick that everyone can enjoy? The kind of movie you watch with friends, reveling in its goofy and lighthearted tone. Is Godzilla a character that should be scary, haunting, and thought-provoking? Or should it be accessible, fun, and entertaining? I personally think that the right answer is that there isn't one. Godzilla shouldn't always be tied to one idea or concept, and insisting that he should be is actually disingenuous to his vast and diverse legacy. Rather, to me, the more interesting question is, what was Godzilla supposed to be before he became a multi-million-dollar franchise with his own hotels, cinematic universes, and stuffed animals? Was Godzilla ever meant to be more than that? And if so, how does 2016's Shin Godzilla remind us? When Ishiro Honda was developing the first Godzilla film, originally titled Gojira, he had in front of him a near impossible task. He needed to craft a monster movie that was genuine, entertaining, and resonated with audiences while still striking fear into their hearts. Initially, the studio and production team behind the film were unsure of its success. With a budget that was 3 times that of the average Japanese film, in a market where science fiction movies were often lampooned by critics, Ishiro Honda's Gojira had nearly all the odds stacked against it. But Ishiro Honda knew this, so he chose a unique approach to Gojira, treating it in a grounded, realistic manner with deliberate political undertones that weren't commonly seen in mainstream monster movies. Typically, the monster movies of the time reveled in the absurdity and fantastical nature of their premises, but Godzilla was different. With harsh shadows, a haunting soundtrack, and visceral scenes of death and destruction, this movie had a nail-biting realism to it. But most importantly, Godzilla wasn't just a generic monster for civilians to scream and run away from. Rather, he was meant to be a living embodiment of the atom bomb. As Ishiro Honda stated, quote, "If our hearts were not in it 100%, it would not have worked. We wanted the monster to possess the terrifying characteristics of an atomic bomb. This was our approach, without any reservations." And the evidence for Godzilla being a nuclear analogy is everywhere in this film. The only reason Godzilla was awoken to begin with was due to the US's reckless and incessant hydrogen bomb tests in the Pacific. When Godzilla walks through cities, he leaves them radioactive and uninhabitable, as though he himself is a living nuclear weapon. Several scenes in this movie offer striking resemblances to real-world events or images. The scenes of civilians in Tokyo suffering from radiation poisoning look as though it was ripped straight out of real footage of survivors from Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The imagery of Tokyo after Godzilla's rampage is also reminiscent of photos of post-World War II Japan. However, the most obvious way in which this film mirrors reality is in the opening scene, in which we see a ship getting destroyed by a flash of white light, which is later revealed to be Godzilla. This moment is a direct reference to the real events of a ship named the Lucky Dragon, an incident in which a Japanese fishing vessel and its crew witnessed a massive flash of bright light, which they would later learn was Castle Bravo, the first in a series of thermonuclear tests conducted by the US in the Bikini Atoll Islands. Crew members of the Lucky Dragon would later suffer serious health complications from the radioactive fallout and ash they were exposed to. When we begin to understand Japan's bloody and complicated relationship with nuclear weapons, it becomes pretty obvious why they chose to visualize it through a giant, fire-breathing monster. But let's talk about Godzilla in this movie. While he's clearly the antagonistic force of the film, he isn't actually evil. He doesn't have malice or ill intent, and while the native people of the islands believe Godzilla is this supernatural figure of destruction, we quickly learn that Godzilla is simply a wild animal that's lashing out. When Godzilla is killed in the finale of this film, it isn't seen as an epic triumphant moment, but rather as melancholic and almost tragic. Godzilla is capable of great horrors, sure, but it didn't ask to be born, to be violently awoken from its slumber and thrust into this new and horrifying world. Godzilla is the last writhing piece of the natural world that cannot be tamed by humanity, a creature that doesn't fit the mold of the world we've created, and because of such, we're forced to use a weapon more horrifying and devastating than the monster itself. In that sense, Godzilla feels like a testament to humanity's inability to coexist with the natural world, and our relentless need to control what we don't understand, and our reflex to destroy it when we can't. However, while Godzilla is the center of this film's focus, I'd argue that the heart and soul of the movie is its human characters. In the story of Gojira, the Japanese government is struggling to find a way to defeat Godzilla, and we later learn that a scientist named Dr. Serizawa has invented a new experimental technology called the Oxygen Destroyer. When asked if he will use his newly invented technology against Godzilla, Serizawa initially refuses. He claims that it was invented purely out of scientific curiosity, and he's afraid of it falling into the wrong hands. However, upon hearing a national broadcast of children singing the song A Prayer for Peace following the destruction of Tokyo, Serizawa reluctantly agrees to use his technology to create a weapon capable of killing the creature. Afterwards, Serizawa burns his notes and research to make sure no one would ever attempt to recreate it, and while he's underwater with Godzilla, he cuts his tow line, ensuring that the secrets of the Oxygen Destroyer would die alongside him and the monster. Whenever Gojira's anti-war themes are discussed, I've noticed that everyone lingers on the obvious nuclear analogy present with Godzilla himself. However, I feel that Serizawa and the story of the Oxygen Destroyer are just as powerful and just as prevalent. It's pretty telling that the character who serves as the movie's moral compass is horrified at the idea of weapons of mass destruction. However, the uncomfortable reality lies in the fact that he does end up using the bomb, that we are capable of creating a weapon more sinister than the monster itself. Yet even then, this weapon was used against a made-up monster, a fictitious existential threat. Serizawa's sacrifice feels like a plead from Ishiro Honda to the world's powers of the time, and almost longing for them to recognize that there is no real-world horror like Godzilla that would necessitate such weapons. Serizawa is also blatant evidence that this franchise is capable of creating compelling and interesting human characters. I so often see people talk about how they hate any human subplots in monster movies and that we should just cut them out or minimize them as much as possible, and I think that's an absolutely ridiculous mindset. I feel like a lot of the issues people have with modern day Godzilla films and the way they write their human subplots are completely absent or fixed in Gojira. This movie takes its time developing the character of Serizawa as well as its other main characters. Not only does it make them into three-dimensional, fleshed-out human beings, but it also doesn't feel like the movie is simply padding time until the monsters appear, unlike certain movies.
It's not all math, Emma. Some things you can't control.
And there are some things that you can't run from.
This is the most obnoxious thing I've ever experienced in my life.
This film makes sure that you care about the people on screen while still making sure that they don't overstay their welcome. They also write our characters in a way that gives them agency and a part to play in the film's conclusion. Serizawa's personal moral dilemma of whether or not he wants to use the Oxygen Destroyer directly impacts the climax of the film and is ultimately what drives the entirety of the third act. So it doesn't feel like the film grinds to a halt whenever it cuts to Serizawa. Rather, it feels like a natural extension of the narrative. This film proves that it is not only possible to seamlessly blend a human narrative into a kaiju film, but that if it's done right, it can be just as riveting, if not more so, than the monsters themselves. Gojira was released in 1954, 2 years after the US occupation of Japan ended. During their occupation, the US used their control of the press and newspapers to promote pro-Western and pro-democracy beliefs, with a heavy emphasis on free speech. Yet, hypocritically, they also censored the Japanese government from discussing the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in mediums such as film and television. Several major US outlets like the New York Times even went as far as to claim that the Japanese government was lying about the radioactivity of Hiroshima in hopes of receiving international sympathy. However, as the US occupation of Japan came to an end, the first major film covering the atomic bombs, called Children of Hiroshima, was set to release in 1952. The film follows the story of a teacher visiting the city of Hiroshima, in which she sees firsthand the effects of radiation poisoning on the child population. The film was met with some criticisms by the Japanese teacher union, claiming it didn't have a harsh enough social commentary. And while there was other politically charged films like Hiroshima, directed by Hideo Sekigawa, Gojira was one of the first Japanese anti-nuclear and anti-war films to gain widespread international success and critical acclaim. However, it is important to note that upon its international re-release, Gojira was edited down to be made more palatable for its American audiences, with most of its apparent politically charged scenes being cut from the film entirely. And there was several scenes of famous actor Raymond Burr added in as well, with the entire film being redubbed Godzilla, King of the Monsters. However, it is a bit hilarious and honestly quite telling that they still left in the most blatant anti-nuclear message in the whole movie: Godzilla himself. But regardless, the original film Gojira remains not only an important piece of cinematic history as the foundation of the kaiju genre, but also an important piece of Japanese history as one of the first major successful anti-war films to have been released post-World War II. But beyond that, it's a testament to how a director can not only transfer his own human experience into a piece of art, but the trauma and pain of an entire generation. So I guess the only question I have now is, how did we go from this to this? What happened? Well, as time went on, the character changed and evolved. Its realism and grit was quickly stripped away and replaced with marketable, family-friendly action. The Showa era quickly turned Godzilla from a monster of chaos and destruction and transformed him into a stoic hero, a friend of humanity who defends the Earth from monsters and aliens. As the Japanese people gradually grew and moved on from the trauma of the Second World War, so did Godzilla. From the late 50s to the early 2000s, Godzilla would come and go with each new generation of movies, leaving their own unique stamp on the franchise. To the colorful and bombastic Heisei era, to the mixed and experimental Millennium films, by the end of 2004, Godzilla would have faced over 20 different monsters in almost 28 different films. However, save for a handful of movies like Godzilla Returns, the gritty realism of the original 1954 film had yet to be recreated. And more than that, the character had yet to be reinvented in a way that captured the terrors and fears of audiences as the original did in 1954. As Ichiro Honda stated, quote, "Godzilla was a product of the times. There previously had been no monster like him, so people were frightened and shocked by him. Now when Godzilla appears in a city, most of the buildings are even taller than he is. The image of what a monster is shouldn't stay the same. It should be different so that people will be shocked and surprised just as they were by Godzilla, King of the Monsters, in 1954. Something new and strange must be created." In 2011, Japan was devastated by what many call the triple disaster. This disaster started when Japan was hit with a massive magnitude 9 earthquake 81 miles east of Sendai, the strongest in its recorded history. The shock from the earthquake also caused a tsunami, which killed nearly 15,500 people and displaced nearly 500,000. To make matters worse, the tsunami also flooded the Fukushima nuclear power plants, located on the eastern coast of Japan. As a result, the Fukushima Daiichi lost power and was unable to cool its nuclear fuel fuel rods, leading to a complete meltdown of all 3 of its reactors in what would turn out to be one of the most catastrophic nuclear disasters of our time. It was later revealed that months prior to the incident, a regular safety check showed that the Fukushima power plant was vulnerable to heavy flooding, yet no efforts were made to update or change the facility's emergency infrastructure. The Japanese government's response to these crises were heavily criticized due to their sloppy response time and their lack of proper oversight and accountability. All of this led to a general mistrust and frustration with the Japanese government and its ridiculous bureaucracy, red tape, and its dedication to outdated ideas and honorifics, but most importantly, the government's inability to change. Shin Godzilla exists to embody those fears and frustrations, to show just how ridiculous and outdated the Japanese government systems and procedures are, and how its inability to accept different or new ideas may just be its downfall. Created by Hideaki Wano, the creator of Evangelion, and Shinji Higuchi, known for his work on the Gamera trilogy, Shin Godzilla was the first Japanese Godzilla film to release in nearly 12 years, and it was meant to serve as the Japanese revitalization of the character for a new generation of audiences. But Shin Godzilla doesn't waste its viewers' time with an over-the-top explanation of where he comes from or why. Rather, we are thrust into the story with him appearing in Tokyo Bay within the first 5 minutes of the movie. Except here, there isn't a monarch or G-force or anything like that. Rather, this movie makes a clear effort to ground itself firmly in our reality, with the Japanese government treating Godzilla as though he's some kind of natural disaster. And as I previously explained, that's kind of the point. This is perfectly encapsulated in how the government initially responds to Godzilla in the film. At the start of the movie, they wave off any notion that the strange activity occurring in Tokyo Bay could be related to a living creature, scoffing at the scientists who suggest so, due to their age and social status. However, when it becomes pretty undeniable that the activity in the bay is being caused by some massive unknown organism, the politicians still continue to ignore the advice of scientists and falsely tell the general public during a press conference that the creature will be unable to go on land. Surprise, surprise, this of course proves to be untrue, with Godzilla making landfall before the press conference is even over. The Prime Minister is given ample opportunities to take military action against Godzilla while he's still in this weaker, larva-like form. Yet he continuously waits and stalls, afraid of how possible civilian casualties would reflect on his career, while also neglecting the countless lives that are actively being lost and ruined due to the monster itself. Trying to take any major action against Godzilla feels impossible. There's always 6 different channels they need to go through to get approval, and between all the red tape and never-ending meetings, trying to get the Prime Minister to make any hardline decisions feels like a never-ending game of tug-of-war. Because the government's initial response to Godzilla is so sluggish and dysfunctional, he is able to escape back to the ocean and return later even more powerful. Similar to the real-world events of the Fukushima meltdown, the Japanese government had several chances to act, but their failure to do so led to an escalation of an already horrible situation. When the rest of the international community sees the destruction Godzilla is capable of, a US-led Security Council decides that while Godzilla is asleep in Tokyo, they will use nuclear weapons to destroy it. For the first time in nearly 70 years, a third nuclear weapon will be used, and yet again, it will be on Japanese soil. With the nuke set to go off in a little over 2 weeks, and the Prime Minister and half his cabinet dead, the government is forced to put their trust into the scientists and experts they had previously waved off, hoping that they can find an alternative solution to defeating Godzilla. It is only then, when they are given the freedom and support to collaborate amongst each other and with other experts around the world, do they formulate a successful alternative plan to stop Godzilla, thus preventing the detonation of the nuclear bomb. The human characters are often criticized in this movie for being two-dimensional or spread thin, but I think that's the point. The film doesn't hyper-focus on any one character because humanity is the character. Our characters are meant to be physical stand-ins for the idealists and the younger generations who want to take action when the government can't. This movie is trying to tell us that our strength doesn't just come from honorifics and a reliance on culture and tradition, but also from our perseverance, hard work, and willingness to compromise and adapt when necessary. This movie is the first in the franchise since the original to use the character in a way that gives for such politically potent and relevant themes and ideas. And that's not to say that no films since the original have tried this. Godzilla Returns, GMK, and Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster are all loaded with social commentary. But in those movies, it often feels more like an afterthought. Meanwhile, Shin Godzilla's entire personality is built around its themes. Just like the original film, Shin Godzilla takes a grounded, realistic approach on how he would actually go about trying to deal with this monster, thus allowing the movie to take on a more serious tone. And this looming threat of a bomb being dropped on Godzilla is an excellent way to give our main characters stakes in their goals, knowing that the fate of Tokyo lies in their ability to come up with an alternative solution to stopping Godzilla. When our characters in Shin Godzilla find out that the US wants to drop a nuclear warhead on Tokyo, they treat it as something more horrifying than the monster itself, similarly to how the Oxygen Destroyer is presented in the original. This is all to say that I think Shin Godzilla really is the only other movie in the franchise that successfully captures the tone and direction of the original film. Shin Godzilla reminds us of why this character exists and how it can give a voice to the cultural and societal anxieties of its time. However, there's one part of this movie that I surprisingly haven't gotten to yet: the star of the film himself. I wouldn't often describe Godzilla as a character that's scary. Is he intimidating? Sure. Badass? Absolutely. But never really scary. He's a terrifying concept, but he himself is rarely presented as something meant to terrify you. Shin Godzilla is the first version of the character that is, to me, horrifying. For years we've been told that this is a creature born from the fires of the atom bomb, and for the first time, he actually looks like it. From his shriveled arms, tiny eyes, and jagged and broken teeth, everything about this creature is unnatural and decayed. Both Hideaki Anno and Higuchi understood that Godzilla is, first and foremost, a monster and should look like it. For a character with dozens of different interpretations, they still managed to deliver something both unique and modern, while also staying true to the mythos of the character. Godzilla's presence in this movie is always felt. Even when he's asleep, he feels like a ticking time bomb that could go off at any moment. But similar to the original, this isn't a monster with evil or malice, rather just a confused and scared creature lashing out on a world that it doesn't understand. When the song Who Will Know plays while Godzilla fires his atomic breath on Tokyo, the lyrics literally tell his inner monologue. As Ichiro Honda famously stated, quote, "Monsters are tragic beings. They are born too tall, too strong, and too heavy. They are not evil by choice. That is their tragedy." The final image of this movie may be my favorite shot in any movie, period. A common theme in monster movies is the idea that humanity is the real monster, and that humans are a virus and a disease, and after a certain point, it can be kind of an eye roll. Like, yes, we get it, humans suck, they make it kinda hard to forget. But the final shot of Shin Godzilla is so haunting, not because it's trying to push a certain idea and theme, but because of how ambiguous it is. We don't know what it means that Godzilla's next form would have been humanoid in nature. Does this mean Godzilla considers humanity to be the final and ultimate form of evolution, or was it just trying to replicate the last thing it saw before it died? We will hopefully never know. All I know is that this image is unsettling in a way that Godzilla hasn't really been before. And the way Godzilla's statue remains standing in the heart of the city is such a great finishing image, and I think it's emblematic of everything I love about this movie. Even though Godzilla was successfully defeated, he still remains in the frame as this hulking figure, a lingering fear in the back of our mind that to me represents the existential dread of nuclear annihilation we've all grown too familiar with. The idea that even though we've avoided nuclear weapons this time, we are still forced to leave the fate of the entire human race with just a handful of world leaders. At any point in time, the monster of our own making may just reawaken and finish what it started.
Full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it was imminent. Vladimir Putin has just addressed the Russian people moments ago, announcing what Putin called the start of a military special operation, in his words, to demilitarize Ukraine.
North Korea caused terror throughout Japan earlier this morning when the rogue regime launched a ballistic missile over Japanese airspace.
Tonight, the drumbeat of war. Taiwan says 28 Chinese warplanes, including fighter jets and nuclear-capable bombers, crossed into its airspace.
We begin tonight with the Middle East in flames. Israel has formally declared war.
Pakistan says it has shot down 2 Indian aircraft, which it claims were over Pakistani airspace.
The news involving Iran and its nuclear capability. Tonight, a top Pentagon official testifying that Iran could now make enough nuclear material for a bomb in just 12 days now. Let's bring in our senior White House correspondent, Mary Grace.